Welcome to the Convergence podcast. I'm your host, Ashok Sivanand.
It's not just about coming up with the right answers, right? It's about coming up with the right answers in such a way that everyone is inspired by those answers, that everyone is motivated to go get their stuff done, that they understand the other parts that other people are working on, that they're not stepping on each other's toes, etc. And all that really stems not from just answering the question of what should we go work on next and why, but making sure that there's real alignment through that communication.
On this show, we'll deconstruct the best practices, principles, and the underlying philosophies behind the most engaged product teams who ship the most successful products. This is what teams are made of. Welcome back, folks. On this episode, I get to speak with Ben Foster. Ben might be one of the most tenured product folks that I've personally gotten to nerd out with. He started working in product in the early 2000s, including at eBay from 2001 to 2005, where he worked for Marty Kagan, who founded the Silicon Valley Product Group and wrote the book Inspired, amongst others. Ben took his career from being a statistics major and working in customer success at a company that sold multi-million-dollar CD-ROMs to Wall Street analysts to now being an advisor or chief product officer for dozens of companies, including at my favorite fitness wearable company, Whoop. Ben is the co-founder of the Prodify group and the co-author of the book Build What Matters. Now I'll be candid. Ben and I went down a few different rabbit holes talking about product strategy, vision, how to craft a really great roadmap, how to communicate that vision to excite your team, how to hire product managers, and how to teach them things like business acumen. And of course, we got to hear a lot of really fascinating stories from his experience at Whoop and the different constraints and opportunities that come into play when you have a piece of hardware that's part of your offering, how you sell hardware as a subscription, and also a really awesome story about how the founder of Whoop had a lot of conviction around his vision, and instead of looking at just the advice or the data points, stuck to that vision and saved killing the company, and instead has now led to being a multi-billion-dollar company. Of course, like most of the episodes, we get to talk about measurement, and Ben gets deep in terms of the difference between customer success, how to measure it, and business success and business value, and how having data and insights can be really dangerous without a strong opinionated vision and strategy. We went so deep, actually, that we had to split this episode into two. On this first of two episodes, we're going to get into Ben's expertise around crafting a solid product roadmap, about how to come up with an opinionated product strategy and communicate that vision with your team, and also switch gears into talking about leading and managing teams and get into interviewing and recruiting, as well as learning and enablement. Hey, welcome to the show, Ben. I've been really looking forward to having this chat.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to it as well. Thanks for having me on the Convergence podcast.
Awesome. So why don't we go back to folks that are, as I call it, tenured as we are. We didn't get the benefit of going to a product school. And so we've all ended up in product in a variety of ways. So I'd love to start there and tell me about how you got into product.
Yeah, everybody who's been doing product for as long as I have always has an interesting story for how they got into it. Like you said, you can't major in it or anything like that. So I majored in statistics. I graduated from Berkeley in 1997. I mean, what an amazing time and place to be, though. I felt like I was in Venice or Florence in the Renaissance or something like that, but the internet version of it. And there was just so many amazing things happening. So I ended up working for a software company that was building software for Wall Street investor types. And we were selling CDs back in the day for $1 million a piece. And these New Yorkers would have these questions about the software, like, why are your numbers 2 basis points off of Bloomberg? And my job was to go figure out the answers to that. Usually the question had a lot of F-bombs thrown in the middle of that as well, but
sure.
We'll skip that part.
When you've got 2 basis points of precision, maybe I was wondering how you can charge $1 million a CD, but the picture's starting to tie in there. And then you've worked at a ton of spots since then. So what are some of the more notable spots that led to kind of going from the early days into a product executive?
Yeah, it's interesting. My jump from this kind of support analyst role into product really kind of came through that company where one day somebody came to my desk and they said, "Hey, you've been filing bugs on this product, and some of those bugs kind of started to turn into feature requests, and feature requests started to turn into product IDs. How would you like a job in product management?" And my honest response at the time was like, "What's product management?" So they kind of like walked me through it and explained it to me a little bit. And I said that was kind of like really cool. So I learned a little bit about what the job was really supposed to be about. I ended up doing some consulting work with a company called ThoughtWorks, which was this boutique firm back in the day before they got to be the juggernaut that they ended up being. And then I kind of, took things from there. I was fortunate enough to be hired on Marty Kagan's team at eBay back in the day from 2001, and I was there until 2005. And I feel like I really learned the foundations, like the fundamentals of doing product well when I was there at eBay. And it was just such a remarkable group of people that I was working with, and kind of took that show on the road, I guess, to work with a bunch of startups. And I always kind of feel like if you have the playbook and you know how to do it, then you're in a good position to kind of understand when you should break that rule book, which sometimes you need to do when you're working with the startups as well. So, one thing led to another, kind of rose through the ranks in product and ended up being the CPO of a variety of companies and things like that. And now I just do a lot of product advisory type work, helping a whole variety of companies with similar kinds of challenges that I've faced previously myself.
That's awesome. And that's at the Prodify group.
Yeah, exactly.
So tell me about how you started the Prodify group. I think you have a co-founder. How did that all come about? You wrote a book.
I moved from Silicon Valley to the East Coast to where I live now in Arlington, Virginia. And ironically, it was to join a tech startup, which back in 2010, nobody left California to go join a tech startup in Arlington. Now it happens all the time, but back then it was sort of like the rare story. So anyway, joined there. We took the company public about 4 years later. It was a company called OPower. It was kind of like a nice success story for this area. And then I sort of parlayed that into an ability to reach out to a bunch of other startups and tech companies in the space and in the region, between DC to New York to Boston, and just worked with a whole variety of different companies, helping them to apply some of the lessons that I had picked up. And I really started to enjoy that. And the kind of funny thing is you get into doing advisory type work because you want to teach all the things that you learned. But I feel like I was actually the one who learned the most through the whole experience, because you start to see the patterns, what makes this kind of company successful and that kind of company unsuccessful. And if you change this, what happens? So there's this kind of level of abstraction, I think, that happens when you can look across a whole variety of logos. And that led to a lot of really interesting insights about what made startups successful, what made larger companies successful as they were scaling, et cetera. And so I joined forces with Rajesh Nurlikar, who is the co-founder of Prodify with me. And he's also the co-author of the book, Build What Matters. And we put a lot of that kind of stuff into the book. And we decided to build a bit of an advisory and coaching practice for product leaders that was really taking a lot of the things that we had picked up, not only from our operational experience, but also some of the things that we had learned as advisors working with so many different companies. And now we have sort of like this very small kind of like boutique practice that's really just got some amazing talent in there. And we try to match, our own experience and our own stories with the kinds of things that companies that we're working with are running into today.
We definitely had a chance to check out some of your stuff, and we love the content that you put out there. And one of the things that I think we get pulled into a lot is around road mapping. And I know the book talks about vision, roadmap, strategy. And the challenge oftentimes is that folks know what's top of mind today. Usually some kind of burning need for some kind of reason. And there's also a semblance of like, hey, leadership's always talking about this, or our strategy team is talking about where we need to be 18 months or 36 months from now. And then bridging between kind of where you are and where we want to be is a challenge. And I think really great product teams can be kind of really helpful with helping carve out what that path could be. So talk to me about road mapping, vision, strategy, and your opinions on that. Any stories, ideally?
It is really interesting. I think if you talk to any person who's been in product for more than a year, they're probably going to have the same kind of story of, we produce this roadmap, we put a lot of thought into it, we do our research, et cetera, and then we share the roadmap with a variety of stakeholders, and everyone's got their concerns. Everyone's got their pet feature that they wanted to have in there. Everybody's kind of questioning, whether this is the right thing or that's the right thing, or, engineers wondering, why the timelines are what they are, et cetera. And it's really hard to get right, because the roadmap sits kind of in the middle. It sits in between execution and sprint planning and things like that, and all the way up to the top of vision and strategy and why are we doing the things that we're doing in the first place, right? Where is this company even headed? And I think what happens is you get these disconnects that emerge when you present or you talk about the roadmap, but they're not really actually gripes about the roadmap. What it is a reflection of a lack of alignment that happened upstream from that, right? So why does somebody have a pet feature? Because they think that that investment in that particular direction is really important, strategically speaking. And you actually think that it's not as important. But if you never had that conversation about strategy, then of course it's going to manifest at some point, and that's usually the point of the roadmap. Same kind of thing happens with vision, and you can kind of keep going upstream and keep coming up with these reasons that there end up being these disconnects. So one of the things we talk about in Build What Matters is the importance of not just jumping straight into a set of priorities and what are we going to roadmap right now, et cetera, but to really make sure that you're investing in that alignment up front across all the different stakeholders of the company, so that the roadmap almost like spits itself out as sort of like the obvious answer to how you're going to make progress in the directions that you want to go.
And I love alignment there, because I noticed that a lot of the time, the naysayers or the folks that seem like the folks that are being roadblocks, oftentimes when you go to a person level with them and try and understand why, you realize that it's oftentimes a lack of context or missed context. And so communicating the roadmap, arguably more important than nailing the roadmap. And what are some things that you've seen that have worked really well to get everyone on board where they're remembering that?
Yeah, Ashok, your point about communication is just such an important one, because it's not just about coming up with the right answers, right? It's about coming up with the right answers in such a way that everyone is inspired by those answers, that everyone is motivated to go get their stuff done, that they understand the other parts that other people are working on, that they're not stepping on each other's toes, et cetera. And all that really stems not from just answering the question of what should we go work on next and why, but making sure that there's real alignment through that communication that you were referring to. So when it comes to communicating a roadmap, I usually like to bundle it with a communication, or at least a reminder of what the vision is. Where are we headed? If we're going to plant a flag at point B and we're standing at point A today, what does point B look like? What is this kind of like promised land that we're trying to get to? And then to describe the strategy, in order to get there, here are the steps that we're going to need to take. And here's the bets that we feel like we need to make. And therefore, the roadmap has the following major kind of like themes that are part of it. We've worked with the engineering team. We've done the customer research. And here's why we're doing the things that we're doing. This team's going to be working on this part of it. That team's going to be working on that part of it. Here's how it all comes together. And are there any questions? And if it can be sort of like framed that way, as opposed to saying, here's a Gantt chart that has a bunch of dates and a bunch of random projects on it, you're kind of getting at the why. And I feel like sometimes that's the part that gets forgotten, because like you said, that's what allows the empowerment of the teams to go make their own decisions, right? Because you're providing them you're not just giving them orders like go build this thing. What you're saying is, I want you to go solve this problem. And here's the context that's behind this. Here's why you need to do that. And that's actually especially inspiring, and it's especially empowering to those teams when you can provide that kind of thing, because now they get what they're trying to achieve. They get how it's going to be measured. And now they have the freedom to make the kinds of calls that they need to, so that they can build the right kinds of things for the customer and for the business.
Fostering an engaged product organization and aligning them with the principles around lean, human-centered design, and agile will more than likely lead to successful business outcomes for your organization. But getting started or getting unblocked can be hard. This podcast is brought to you by the player coaches over at Integral. They help ambitious companies like you build amazing product teams and ship products in artificial intelligence, cloud, web, and mobile. Listeners to the podcast can head on over to integral.io/convergence and get a free product success lab. During this session, the Integral team will facilitate a problem-solving exercise that gives you clarity and confidence to solve a product, design, or engineering problem. That's integral.io/convergence. Now, back to the show.
Startups and also some pretty established companies as well. And one of the things that we notice when it comes to road mapping with the bigger companies is initially everyone's kind of aligned with, okay, this is a much better path in terms of what hills we need to win in order to win the war, sort of thing, until it starts to sort of brush up against existing business. Like, hey, I don't know if we want to put this out there. It's going to cannibalize from this. And we've reported to market that we're expecting this kind of revenue. And I don't know if we want to mess with that. And speaking of the ironic thing is that the reason they were maybe investing in this kind of innovation in the first place is to play defense against someone in Silicon Valley or a more nimble startup coming up and doing exactly the same. So what's your advice for someone in the C-suite or in the board of one of these bigger companies that is debating cannibalizing? Because I know in some cases it doesn't make sense, but most of the time maybe it does.
Yeah, I mean, there's that famous moment where Steve Jobs was, standing up on stage in front of Apple post an acquisition, I think, and somebody was asking about why they were investing in this area, and the question was basically framed as like, isn't this going to cannibalize this massive thing that I've been working on for a long time? And his response was, I'd rather cannibalize it myself than have somebody else do it for me. And I love it. It's like I remind companies of that kind of thing all the time, right? Which is like to basically say this is going to be cannibalized, like it's going to be taken over. This product, this market, et cetera, is going to become obsolete by some point in the future. And if you sort of take that at face value, then the question becomes not, well, what do we do to kind of like protect the short-term revenue stream? It's what do we do to ensure that we're in the pole position to be successful in this, not just now, but 5 years from now, 10 years from now, et cetera. And that comes back to this importance, I think, of thinking long term, right? If you're only thinking short term, you're always going to be thinking about how do we eke out whatever we can in this moment. And what's going to happen is, you get the incremental, small scale gains, over the course of a quarter, et cetera. And in order to get that, you end up sacrificing where the attention really should have gone, which is what the future is going to hold and how you're going to go get there. If you look at product vis-a-vis the other functions in a business, marketing's job is to go tell the story and go find leads and, things like that, right? Sales' job is to go convert the customer value that's already been created in the product into business value by finding more customers. Customer success is to try to, get as much, business value from the existing customer set that you have. But there's only one party who's responsible for building more customer value. And that's the product and the engineering team, right? That's the function of R&D spend, is to go build on that. And the more of that customer value that you can create, the more opportunity there is in the future to extract that business value. And I think if you end up too short-sighted with that, you almost forget about the customer in between. You're thinking about rounding the corners on buttons. You're thinking about improving, a workflow by, 0.5%. And what you're not thinking about is why are customers even buying this product in the first place? And how can we broaden our market? Or how can we, yes, even if it requires cannibalizing this part of our revenue, how do we make sure that we're in the right kind of position to be successful long term?
I love that you brought up customer value and business value, because in a very simplistic sense, and ideally, you can take what it's going to cost to build and operate it, and you've got a dollar figure there, what kind of customer value you can generate in terms of how much cost you're saving or generating for the customer. And then the business value is kind of like the difference between those two in a very simplistic sense. The reality is it's kind of hard to quantify some of those things, especially if you're comparing an existing product where you're mature enough that maybe it's not even revenue, but it's profits that you're looking at to measure the value. And then earlier stage things, you're not even revenue positive yet, but there's a lot of signs that tell you that this is going to be big. So how would you go about trying to compare apples and oranges there, but making decisions nevertheless around important decisions around prioritization and resource allocation, especially when it comes to comparing customer value and business value?
There's that old adage of you can't manage what you can't measure, right? And I think that it starts there with, you have to measure customer value to some extent. And Ashok, with all the with all the product metrics dashboards that you've seen, what are the typical things that you see out there, right? It's going to be revenue. It's going to be retention. It's going to be NPS scores, maybe, it's going to be usage of certain features, right? I mean, I don't know. Anything else that you would add to that list?
Yeah. Active usage, probably the standard kind of list for sure.
All of those things, even things like NPS, that's actually a business value metric, because what you're asking the question of is, would you refer us to somebody else? Like, would you tell your friends and family about how cool this product is? What you're not asking is, are you actually getting the ROI from this that you were expecting? You were buying our B2B2C thing to improve the quality of your customer's experience. Is our product actually doing that for you, right? And retention, is a function of that. Like, it's unlikely that customers are going to retain on your product if they're not getting the value from it. But that's like the trailing indicator of success. And I think that it's fascinating that companies tend to have these product metrics dashboards, and they're very data driven. It's all a very good thing, but that they're like myopically focused on the things that matter to them as businesses, right? I've had so many conversations with startup founders, in some sort of like an intro discussion or something like that. And they get up to the whiteboard and I'm like, well, tell me about, what your product's all about. Tell me about where you guys are going. And they'll say, oh, we're going to disrupt this industry. Or they'll say things like, my vision is to get to a $20 million ARR or something like that. I'm like, no. Like, you're misunderstanding. That's the byproduct of you doing a great job of delivering customer value. Nobody goes and disrupts an industry directly. What does it mean to disrupt an industry? It means to solve a customer's problem so well that their expectations shift away from all the existing solutions that are already there. And what's amazing to me still is how frequently I can ask this question and how rarely the word customer actually comes up, right? And it reflects in the way that they operate. They don't have a customer success dashboard. They have a customer health index where they're measuring, green, yellow, red, our customer is going to retain with us and things like that. But they're not asking whether the customer is actually getting the value from the product that they were looking for. And so I've tried to reverse that with every product, company that I've bid in, to make sure that we have not only a product metrics dashboard for the company that reflects on whether we're successful, but indicates whether the customer is successful.
I love that. And I love that you started with that quote, if you can't measure if you can't manage what you don't measure. I think the interesting thing that we probably need to fact check here, we'll put in the show notes, is there's a second half to that quote that says you can't manage what you don't measure, or you can only measure what you manage, even if you measure the wrong thing and it's detrimental to the organization. And so I think in the larger organizations, one of the things we've had to pull people away from is being married to super high precision, which when, you've had a product in the market for decades, you have a lot of data points and you can have a lot of decimal points on your data, even if it's, when you're looking to do something new, not the right data point to look at. And so sometimes we find we're having to convince people away from, hey, we need to let go of this comfort of precision and switch over to accuracy. And the accuracy in the early days may be messy. It may have a plus or minus delta on it compared to 3 decimal points, but it's telling you what really you want to move the needle on. And I think that's where customer discovery and some earlier pieces come into play. So I'm curious, can you think of any stories or examples of kind of early stage research that led to aha moments? You can scrub the names as much as you feel comfortable.
Yeah, sure. I've worked with a whole variety of clients on this particular issue. I think the thing that has been pretty common is, like you said, sometimes you get it too detailed on micro changes, like, this metric moved in the right direction by 0.2 basis points or whatever. It's like, who cares? At the end of the day, you're investing X amount of dollars into R&D, and the benefit of that is like $20. Who really cares? And they think that sometimes they're getting directional guidance, and that's broken for a couple different reasons. I think number one is there's just statistically speaking, there's statistical significance, and it's amazing to me how often a misunderstanding of statistical significance leads to really bad decision making in these organizations. Even in these moments where you should be very data driven, they're misrepresenting the data because they don't really understand some of those concepts. And I try to do a lot to teach companies about those kinds of things and what it means about how they should make decisions. But the second piece of this is there are some decisions that shouldn't necessarily be focused on these immediate data points that you see sort of like in real time, and I think that it's like the pendulum swung in a lot of ways over the last 20 years or the last 15 years in product. When I joined product, God knows how many years ago at this point, we were very not data focused. It was like highest paid person's opinion. It was, hey, I'm the product manager, so I just make a call. It was like I could do, customer research and have, 4 conversations, and suddenly we're taking the product in a new direction for, millions of dollars of R&D spend. That's not the right answer either, just to be really clear. Mm-hmm. But I think the pendulum swung like so far in the other direction that I see a lot of companies that have taken agile to like an extreme, where I actually describe it as a dysfunction of product. And I call it like the roller coaster, where you're so not wedded to what problem you're solving that you just let the data kind of like drive you in whatever, path it does. Right. And so it's like going swimming in the ocean. You're trying to swim somewhere and you're just like, well, I'm just going to let the current take me wherever it takes me. Like, it's kind of a dangerous idea in a lot of ways. So they'll change something and then they'll try to see what the results are immediately. And they're like, if they don't have an incredibly obvious, massive impact in the first 2 weeks, it's like we're gonna fail fast. We're gonna pivot away from it. And all that you do is you just fail fast repeatedly, and you do it really, really, in an expedited way. But it doesn't get you any closer to actually like not failing, to actually succeeding over the long term. And I think that when you don't have a sense of the direction that you want to head, you're kind of like at the mercy of whatever data you happen to see, because you don't have any alternative. Like the example that I use on this a lot is, we all use navigation apps and things like that when we're driving, right? So you might use Google Maps to plan where you're headed, et cetera, but you have some sort of a destination in mind. Now you can bust out Waze to go, drive around and try to save yourself a little bit of time in traffic. But Waze works because you have a destination in mind, right? You say, here's where I am and here's where I want to get. And it says, okay, well, here's the best path to get there. But imagine if you used Waze and you never put in a destination. All that's going to happen is it's just going to look at the traffic around you and be like, well, you can avoid the most cars by going this direction. Oh, okay, now you can avoid the most cars by going this direction, until you eventually find yourself in the middle of nowhere, not even anywhere remotely close to where you had been intending to go. And sometimes you use Waze when you put a destination, and it doesn't say, hey, rerouting you due to traffic. It says, I know that the traffic is heavy in this direction, but we're going to stay on course despite the fact of the 12-minute delay or whatever, right? And the reason that's really powerful, I think, as an analogy, is because founders, product leaders, et cetera, are faced with this all the time. You get some data that shows that like you put something out there and it's kind of like, it sort of worked. It sort of didn't, what do I do with this? Is that evidence that I need to pivot really hard away from it? Or is that evidence that I need to keep working on it and I need to find a way to persevere? Like it's not perfect the way that it is, but it doesn't really help me to decide what I need to do next. And I think that if you have clarity as to where you're headed, then is this an obstacle that I can go around? Is that the easiest path to get around here? Or do I need to go through it? And that's the part that most product teams really struggle with.
Have you read the book The Dip by Seth Godin?
I haven't.
So, high level, one of the examples he says is like organic chemistry in undergrad is one of the hardest courses that most pre-med kids are going to take. And a lot of them go in there kind of saying, I guess I'll go into med school because a lot of the other folks here are. And then there's a few kids that are like, no, I had this thing happen in my childhood and I knew since I was 13 years old that this is what I wanted to do, right? And those kids are more likely to kind of like redo organic chemistry even if they fail it the first time and persevere through and continue on that path to med school and everything else. And some of the others kind of, they think it's all going to be great and the doctor's life is advertised anyway as being glamorous. But then you kind of really hit the first few forks in the road and then you realize, okay, maybe this isn't for me. And I'm wondering if you have any sort of examples or analogies in terms of like the destination and what is it that helps you validate that, hey, no, this is where we set out and this is where we should keep going versus should we rethink the plan?
Absolutely. I'll use an example from the company where I was most recently the CPO, which is Whoop. And Whoop makes a wearable device. It's getting a lot of traction. Nice. All right. We're both just sharing our wearables on our wrist there. And, in the beginning, when I was an advisor to the company, there were a lot of other advisors that were giving all kinds of thoughts based on what they had seen, be successful in the market. So, it's like, oh, your wearable has to have a screen. If it doesn't have a screen, there's no point in having it. And, the CEO was kind of getting beat up over this kind of thing. And there were reasons to believe that might be the case because, people were buying Fitbits and things like this. But he was sort of like steadfast because he said, no, like this is about being more like, I know what this product is going to be about and I know what the differentiator is going to be. And the whole thing of Whoop was that you wear it 24/7. That when you sleep, you get to see what your recovery is. Based on your recovery, you get to know what kind of strain you should take on. Based on the amount of strain that you took on, you know what time you need to go to bed. And it sort of completes the cycle, right? But if it had a screen, then the battery life would get drained like super fast. And the key to this was that it needed to be something that you could wear kind of like permanently. So instead of investing in a screen, which would drain battery life, even though everybody was saying that's the direction you had to go, instead, it was like, no, let's go invest in a charging solution that allows you to charge it while it's on your wrist. Mm-hmm. So taking like a completely different approach than what the sort of, standard thoughts were of the day, and went and built a tremendous product based on that. There were a lot of people who said you can't do it as a subscription because you have the upfront cost of all the hardware, the cash flow doesn't really work, et cetera. Amazon has these examples as well, right? Or FedEx, there's like the great, story of the guy who started FedEx, writing the paper as an MBA. He got like an F on the paper by saying, we're going to send all the boxes to one location and then send them all back, again, from there. And that was how FedEx really got like founded. So there's all this kind of like counter, sort of like strategy that's not typical that I think can be rewarded when like I'm sure the early data in all those cases made it like this is something that's going to be really challenging. So there were these moments where at Whoop there was like, pressure to go do a particular thing. And sometimes it just needed to be solved. And one of the things was, go use somebody else's hardware. Just build software and layer it on top rather than building your own. Like, why would you take that kind of thing on? There's a lot of complications with it. You're trying to, get, data at certain intervals, et cetera. But in order to provide the types of guidance and the kinds of coaching that Whoop knew was possible, they knew they couldn't do that by layering on top of somebody else's device because they weren't going to record data at the same kind of fidelity that was required for Whoop to provide that kind of thing. So they're kind of needed to make that investment. And that was a thing that was challenging. There were definitely moments where people thought, PPG sensors weren't going to be able to make this happen. And yet the company needed to persevere as opposed to pivot away. And I honestly would say if they had pivoted away, the company would be dead today instead of being a multi-billion-dollar valuation business.
I totally believe it. As I was mumbling earlier, what I was showing Ben is that we're both rocking the Whoops here. And so I'm fairly familiar with the product. So we're going to go a little bit deeper around a lot of things here. And I love that. I love the story around the screen compromise because I've wondered about that. And in my case, one of the things that drew me to it was that it didn't have a screen for different reasons completely, where I didn't want one more place where I would be distracted and have notifications and everything. And on the other side of it, if you do a really great job of building the product, you're going to get the user's screen time anyway. Because now when people ask me how I'm feeling or how did I sleep, sometimes I'm compelled to go look at my Whoop app and tell them versus looking within. And so it's the first thing I look at every morning to see how I'm doing and how to kind of plan my day out based on how my sleep and recovery and everything is. Of course, one of the challenges, we do a lot of work in the auto industry, and there's, I don't know if I've characterized it this way before, but there's almost two streams of innovation that we get to work on. There's stuff that's completely outside of the vehicle. If you're creating a new mobility solution and facilitating ride sharing or something, and then there's stuff that needs to be integrated in the vehicle. Of course, the stuff that's integrated in ends up being like the opportunity for value is way higher, but the complexity associated with now getting into a hardware roadmap ends up being a big pause for question. So maybe let's start kind of high level. Is this the first hardware software integrated product you worked on, or had you worked on any of them before?
Yeah, in an operational role, it was. I've advised companies that have had hardware and software components and things like that previously, but the in an operational role, it really was the first time. It's interesting and it's different in a lot of ways. Certainly, hardware is very different than software, but what was really interesting was thinking about the overall user experience that was an umbrella that spanned both. And so it was actually a good forcing function in a lot of ways, because it is easy when you're in software to think, okay, maybe we just think about what you're going to work on in the next 3 months, 6 months, et cetera. And then we'll just keep, rinse and repeat. And, when I was giving the advice earlier saying, I think it's really valuable to think long-term about where you're headed, to get alignment around that, et cetera. I mean that even for just a pure software company, but it's an amplified importance when you're talking about a hardware and software, piece, because the hardware ends up being the constraint to the user experience that you want to create. And what you have to be smart about is, where am I willing to have those constraints? Because I don't think that I need, a huge amount of, let's say, memory or storage or, anything like that on this device, because I just don't even know how I would use it. Like, let's not increase the cost of the production of these units. Let's instead try to keep it as narrow as we can, so we can keep the costs low, so that we can, either pass those savings to the end consumer or reinvest it in R&D, et cetera, right? But you have to allow for the capabilities of the future, and you got to plan for those up front, because by the time you go from conception of a hardware device to it actually being on people's wrists, to the time that it needs to last in market, until the next generation of the hardware is created, you're talking about several years in the future. So it required you to think about, what is that user experience that we want to enable several years down the line? And you had to get agreement on that. So it's kind of like, on the one hand, you can say, oh, that sounds like it's really tough. It's really, hard. But honestly, those are the kinds of discussions we should have been having as a company anyway. And it was a nice forcing function that kind of required us to have that kind of, discussion of, does it need to have haptic triggers? Does it need to have SpO2 monitoring? What does the battery life need to be, et cetera? Because in order to answer those questions, we had to say, well, what's the user experience that we're going to try to create that are going to be predicated on those capabilities?
And I know your path there to getting into product. I'm sure along the way you've had to hire, manage out a number of product folks. When you look at a resume, when someone tells you about an experience, is there anything that maybe stands out to you that you might more likely take a chance on someone?
Sure. It's really hard to get through a resume. It's easy to tell a story about the kinds of things that you've done previously. I certainly, one thing I look for in a resume is, do they talk about the outcomes that they delivered? Do they talk about the customer value that they created? And if they can talk about those things, then usually it's a very good sign. And if they say, my job was I managed this thing and I told 20 engineers what to do at a time, it's like you're just thinking about your role in very much the wrong way. So I'll pass on those people and I'll kind of have the other ones come in for an interview. To me, the key is actually during the interview. And my thing that I like to do is I want to see how they make decisions, because product management is all about judgment. You're making decisions all day long. This design or that design, this customer or that customer, this priority or that priority, right? Like, just all day long, it's decisions. And it requires good judgment to be good at doing product. And what I don't like are those questions like, where you give them like a textbook question. You're just going to get a textbook answer, or you say, tell me about a time when you blah, 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 blah. And it's good to ask that. I want to know that they have experience with it. But a lot of times they're working as a team. And so it's really hard to know what their individual personal contribution to that would have been, or what would have happened had it been a different product manager in their seat instead of them. So what I like to do is have them put their money where their mouth is. Somebody might say, oh, I always make data-driven decisions, or, whatever. You're like, okay, well, here's a case that we have. Here's a thing that we're running into at this company right now. How would you think about this? How would you make a call on, here's what we're faced with. Like, how would you do it? And it's funny how many times people will say, oh, I always make data-driven decisions. And you throw something in front of them and they don't ask a single question about data, or you ask them like, okay, what experiment would you run in order to get the data that would allow you to make a good decision? It's like, oh, they make good data-driven decisions when somebody hands them the data, but I want to know at a startup, are they going to be able to figure this stuff out on their own, not sort of be reliant on some other party to go make this happen? So I try to see how they actually think, and a lot of times what I'll do is I'll question their judgment on things and see whether they can stand when they need to, and whether they can also back down when they need to. So if I give them some sort of like a quick assignment or whatever and have them, share with me what their thoughts are, I don't care whether they got the right answer. Of course, they're not going to get the right answer. Mm-hmm. But if I say, hey, I'm not really sure that I agree with this part. Like, what do here's some very good rationale why I think this might not be a good thing. Are they just like totally stuck with their own thing because they came up with it? Well, guess what? That's how they're going to act when they're on the job as well. Right. And if I give them some sort of pressure or some sort of feedback saying, I'm not really sure about this, but it actually is a really good idea, I think, I'll sometimes challenge them on that. And I want to see, like, can they convince me that they're right? And do they know that in this case they should convince me that they're right, and in this case they should sort of like change their minds? And if they can do those things right, then it's an indication that they have good judgment. But it also shows me how they work with other people, with their peers, how they work with people who are superiors to them in the organization, et cetera. And I want to see if they can be effective in that way. And if they can, to kind of back to your original point about communication, that's what I'm able to assess, is their judgment and their communication.
Staying on this topic, say you've hired this person, they're maybe post-technical, but they seem to do the problem solving and everything in the interview pretty well. In a product role, they've got to think like a business person and integrate into the technology teams. And like in my case, I would bias a lot towards the technology, and it was not quite second nature to think about the business. How, if you've encountered this, what do you send folks off to help get their business acumen up to speed? Or it's hard. And
I actually decided to build my own on that. So when I was at Whoop, and I've done this at other companies as well, I created it's called a mini MBA for product managers, and I go through, here are the metrics that you need to understand. Here's how this business actually like really works from a financial standpoint. I'll take the models that the CFO has, and I'll put them up on a screen and be like, we're going to walk through this, and I want you to understand the difference between all these different types of revenue. What's the difference between, revenue looking back? What's the difference between that and ARR? What's the difference between ARR and MRR partway through the year? And what's the difference between, this and that? Like I kind of go through those things and make sure that they really understand the differences, because I want to make sure that we have a shared language with which we can talk about these things. I can give them that context and say, hey, look, we're doing great when it comes to the unit economics, but, hey, let's take the subscription business with hardware. We actually, in the short term, lose money with every customer that we acquire. So, we could do that. But if we actually grew too fast, it would be a problem financially for us, right? Like, we need to do this. So you're saying, like, why don't we do more with marketing or whatever right now? Like, maybe that actually isn't really the right answer. And what we should do is something in building this, kind of better product over here that's going to have more lasting effect. Or, if I can get more cash up front because I can get more people to pay for an upfront annual subscription as opposed to paying month to month, then they've paid for themselves right now. And that allows us to recycle cash really swiftly to then reinvest it in marketing spend to then go find more of those people. So why does the percentage matter in these regards? This is why. Let me explain it to you. And I think it's important that you do that for the individual business. It's not like general MBA kind of stuff. Like if it's a subscription business, talk about the subscription metrics. If it's B2B SaaS model, talk about those things, right? But make sure that every single product manager who's on the team really has a good appreciation of this. And one thing I've also done is try to invite the engineering leads and the UX leads into those conversations as well, so that everyone is talking about the same kinds of things. And it's amazing to see their eyes light up and be like, oh, I finally get it for the first time. Okay. And it completely shifts their ideas of the things that they need to focus on. And it unlocks all these ideas that have been sort of sitting there that they didn't think were important because they didn't really understand the business context in which they were operating.
I love that. And I think a lot of business leaders are hesitant to share that level of detail with the team. And most of those reasons are us negotiating with ourselves. Every single time I've done it or I've convinced a client to do it, the number of ideas, the amount of creativity that you unlock in your team once you give them a combination of creativity and confidence is amazing. And there's something we're always hesitant about with respect to finances that we don't want to share too much, but we want folks to be business people alongside us, and that's the core that's the core scorecard at the end of the day, regardless of what we're building, right?
You cannot have empowerment without transparency, period.
All right. I'm going to be following up with you to find out more about this mini MBA.
Nice.
I might be able to learn something too. So I got the flip of that question. So we got some PMs that come in from non-technical backgrounds, and not all of them have to learn how to code in order to be really effective working with engineers. But at the same time, it's good to know enough so that you can be collaborative, where that you're not putting a lot of that onto the engineering lead or whoever. So what's the thing that you would have that non-technical PM learn to know enough?
It's really hard to point to a specific course or, a particular kind of presentation. I wish it was as simple as it was on the other end, to be totally honest. In my own experience, I never learned to code. I can't read anybody else's code. I don't know what it means if I check it out. But over the years, I've learned pretty well what kinds of things are easy, what kinds of things are hard, what kinds of things are possible, what kind of, what a memory leak means, any of that kind of stuff, right? That helps me to do my job best. And I think it's essential that you have an understanding of those things, because otherwise you can't participate in the conversation. Engineering is saying, hey, this thing is falling behind. Here's why. This thing's more complicated than we thought. We've got this trade-off that I need you to help make. Well, how are you going to participate in that if you don't really understand the details? You're just going to have to take it at face value. And that means you're not really in control of the decisions getting made. What kind of quality judgment, so what we just talked about, can you really make if you don't really understand the context? And so I think you need to have some of those kinds of things. Honestly, in my case, it was picked up just on the job through experience, having conversations. But I think that the thing that I look for is people who are really curious, because the curious people will start to learn those kinds of things more and more, and much more quickly than somebody else who doesn't necessarily have it. So it is important that it's there, but I don't think you need to learn how to code either. I think that there's some companies that say, I'm never going to hire a product manager who doesn't know how to code or something like that. And if I'm a case in point, I don't think that it's actually necessary. But the way I would think about it is it's very similar to, let's say building a house, right? You have somebody who's designing a house, and that's the product manager. And then you have the architect and the builders. And those are really the engineers. But you're going to be a really crappy house designer if you don't know what materials can support what weight, and how, the physics of building a house actually works, and what the nature of the foundation needs to be. And even other things like legal requirements for building in that area and things like that. Like you have to have an appreciation of these things, because that's the medium in which you're going to be operating. And it'll be like a sculptor not knowing anything about stone. You might have a vision for this 3-dimensional object, but you kind of need to understand where it chips and how it doesn't, and things like that. And that doesn't mean that you have to be great with a chisel, but it does mean you have to be around it a lot. And totally. I wish I had a great answer for how people could really accelerate getting there, other than just straight up experience and exposure to it. But that's honestly the best answer that I can think of.
Yeah, fair enough. One of the things I've done is I'll pair with someone on building a spreadsheet together. And it's one of the more I'm one of those folks that in another life I might have competed on competitive Microsoft Excel kind of stuff. I get dopamine out of it for whatever reason. So I'll pair with them and I'll say, hey, I need to build this dashboard, and this is the data. So we got to get from this data set here, and this is what it's got to look like, because this is what I need to show the board or whatever. What's the steps along the way that we're going to take? And then, how do we make that an interactive dashboard where the data gets manipulated? And then the next thing you know, they understand kind of all the steps along the way of the architecture. So even if you don't know how to write code, you're at least able to talk to an engineer about hey, at what layer of this are we trying to solve this problem? Where does it cut through? Where should it be isolated, and so forth? And so maybe it's something we could try out sometime.
I am pretty good with Excel as well. So yeah.
You went to school for SCAD, so I hope so. Thank you for joining me on the Convergence podcast today. Subscribe to the Convergence podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your content. If you're listening and found this helpful, please give us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button and tell me what you think about what you heard today.